Welcome back, nerds. Fino here. If you've been offloading your friend points, you may have run into a problem where you constantly hit the extended CE cap. Well, here's a look at the friend point CEs to help you decide which ones you should keep and which ones you can safely use up for more space. Let's start with the 1 and 2 star CEs. These invariably have effects that are way too small to justify running on your front line or maybe even on your back row. By and large, I'd only use these as the base for CE bombs. Starvation is the coolest art and is therefore the one I use for that purpose. Moving on to 3 stars, we have Azure, Verdant, and Crimson Black Keys. These give generic buffs to Arts, Quick, and Buster respectively, 10% each. For main attackers, you're much better off running something with Substance. As for your reserves, In my experience, if I need to run a finisher, I'm better off upgrading them to a 4 or 5 star CE and taking the cost off whatever my supports are equipping. Either way, you shouldn't feel the need to keep the various black keys in your inventory. Stuffed Lion. This one gives up to 1k health to your party when its carrier dies. For on-death CEs, a Battle of Camlann is the default, since charge is typically more valuable than a paltry amount of health. Camlann isn't a friend point CE, but it's an extremely common gotcha 3 star. You'll find plenty over time. Ending the battle sooner or building a defensive noble phantasm is way more important than 1k health. It's like a single hit from an early game enemy, so feel free to use these up. Hermitage, a 3-turn arts buff. If a servant is worth running a CE on at all, you want to give them the tools to accomplish something. Limiting their impact to 3 turns with no starting NP and a card type specific bonus is doing them a pretty big disservice. Not to mention that for some portion of those 3 turns, you won't draw their arts cards. Unless of course they're the only one left on the field, in which case they're taking all incoming damage, and they're probably dead before the 3 turns are up. Demon Boar is in a similar situation, 3-turn quick buff. Again, not impactful enough to justify its limited duration. At least with Hermitage you could sell yourself the delusion that you're gonna build up an NP in time. Demon Boar only really does that if you're running Scotties, at which point you'd be massively shortchanging your attacker by not giving them a real CE. Self-Geas Scroll. This buffs your stun chance. Technically, this is a pseudo-event CE that gave bonuses during the Fate Zero crossover, but the rerun's long gone, so I wouldn't worry about that. As for the stun chance, that's way too small of an effect to justify running it. In general, I think of the event Stardom CEs as giving a much more immediate and comparatively reliable bonus. They're much more expensive in terms of party cost, sure, but if you're in the position of running a weak stunner with Self-Geas Scroll, you should consider making a better team. Galahad Mash with Battle of Camlann is the gold standard for filler combos, and it's a hard one to beat. Certainly not with crap effects like this. Freelancer. It gives a reasonable 30% increase to crit damage, but only on quick cards. Unlike most other CEs where they give weak magnitudes, they experimented with a very narrow scope instead. Very early accounts may find this useful if they're enamored with a quick servant like Jing K, but I see the design as a bit counterproductive. Typically, and this is before Mighty Chains rendered this discussion moot, I might build stars with quick cards, but I spend them with buster cards. So when it's time to cash in, a Freelancer's not really gonna pull its weight. Not to mention that once Mighty Chains are added to the game, you likely won't be doing dedicated quick Brave Chains outside of Scotty teams, and those don't need help with crit damage, so I have a hard time coming up with a reason to keep it. Mooncell Automaton. Weak rainbow buffs. Technically this increases drops for the extremely ancient Moon Goddess event, but I wouldn't expect a 3rd run of that like, ever. Weird how it never did anything in the CCC event, but the point is that you don't have any reason to keep it. There's pretty much no situation where you take this over a dedicated card type booster with a stronger effect, many of which are already on this list as being expendable. Like you could hand this to Geronimo and he'd toss it in the trash as being too crap even for him. Runestone. A bit of debuff resistance, a bit of star absorption. If your servant is important enough where you want him to absorb stars, you'll want something far more substantive like Seal Destination Enforcer at the very least. Anchors Aweigh, an extremely small heal per turn. We're talking 200 tops. That's not a relevant amount, so you're really just wasting party cost to heal off a fraction of an enemy attack. If that's a serious concern, run a servant that heals or use mitigation CEs instead. Beast of Billows. This gives Lancers increased NP damage. As you'll see with a lot of low rarity damage CEs, you're probably better off with an event freebie 5-star instead. If your servant is important enough to invest further damage, give him the good stuff. Then you should be wary of NP damage effects that don't come with starting charge. That's specifically NP damage modifiers I'm talking about. Unless you give crazy amounts of damage like Black Grail, that's usually too big of a drawback to justify. The same applies to Storch Ritter, which gives NP damage for Berserkers, and Bygone Dream, which does the same for Assassins. Then there's Seeker of Miracles. It gives MP damage, but instead of for a class, it's for Divine Servants. Same deal, it's somewhat less restrictive, but the low magnitude and lack of starting charge is a huge downside. Lugh's Halo. Sun Resistance. In my experience, spam stuns are something you're better off just rolling the dice on, and anything substantial typically is related to the mechanics of a specific fight and comes with an extremely high proc chance. Higher than you can meaningfully reduce with a 30% stun resist effect. Not really worth the inventory space. Clock Tower, 3% charge per turn, like a really crap Prisma Cosmos. Charge regen is a relevant effect only when it reaches a certain magnitude. You're aiming for something close to 10%. 3% likely means either you or your opponent will be dead long before your NP fully recharges. Day After, debuff resist and a paltry amount of NP per turn. If Clock Tower is too slow to make the cut, this one doesn't have a chance in hell. Spell Tome, 20% star generation. I'd say raw star gen CEs are kinda terrible categorically. Star dumps and star income are generally where you want to focus your efforts. Your main attacker will want nothing to do with it, and if your plan is to have someone rotate in with this equipped, cook up some stars the hard way and pass them on to your main, you'll find that far too slow to work in most fights that matter. Better to take a taunter and give them a star dump instead. Dragonkin. Generic NP damage at a slightly lower magnitude than the restricted ones. Still not worth keeping. It's slow, and it's weak. Rin's Pendant. 20% crit damage. If your attacker is important enough where you're worried about their crits, give them the good stuff. At least in Entumbra. No half measures. Motored Cuirassier. 10% damage against riders. Special attack buffs are normally pretty interesting, but 10% is way too small to justify running it over a generic damage source. Mana Gauge is in a similar boat with 10% damage against casters. For comparison, a 0-star Origin Bullet gives a 35% version of the same effect with Invuln Pierce. And that's about the point where I'd consider it a reasonable option. At 10%, I'd rather have a generic CE with a less restrictive effect. Sorcery Ore, 20% NP generation. Your account will outgrow these pretty quick. Art's main attackers want something that also buffs their damage, while supports are better off with starting NP and NP regeneration effects if you need theirs. Light of Wisdom, 8% arts and 5% NP gain. I mean, it's kind of a step in the right direction, but the effect magnitudes are absolutely paltry. The stats are just way too diluted to be practical. Before we get to the good stuff, our final crap entry is False Attendant's Writings. Debuff resistance. It's kind of a weird effect. Sometimes servants with high innate resistance can ignore the occasional boss mechanic, but in general it's hard to cheese the important stuff. For most cases, I'd say you're better off running cleanse effects instead of committing resources to gambling on debuff resistance. Now we get to the stuff that you actually may want to keep. First and most importantly is Dragon's Meridian. 50% starting charge when limit broken. This is one of the best friend point CEs. New accounts will want all the starting charge effects they can get, and even mature accounts can stick this on a support like Astoria to have cheap and ready access to their impactful noble phantasms, whether in combination with a pen skills or a second support. Thumbs up. Parted Sea. One-hit evasion, some paltry debuff resistance. I personally haven't run into a situation where it's been decisive, but a one-hit evade CE is actually something with niche tactical value when you're running with limited cost. Maybe you have it on George and it's a very predictable fight where you can time his entrance with a single target enemy NP. He eats it on turn 1 and hopefully survives, letting you play for time to get full use out of his multi-turn taunt. Maybe that's a little far-fetched, but I keep a copy out of an abundance of caution. Honestly, you could probably ditch yours if you're feeling less paranoid. The Beauty at the Window. This gives 15% buff success chance, which would be a sick joke if it weren't for the other sick joke in the game, Imperial Privilege. If you're not in the position of running Ozymandias, some servants very early into an account's life may in fact gain more damage from making Imperial Privilege more reliable than they lose from running it. It's more reliable than the 2-star CE with buff success, so I keep a copy around for its rare effect. It's one of 3 CEs with this effect. And finally, we have Azoth Blade. 10% defense. Nothing special, but if you need a filler CE on something you don't necessarily want to die, it's not a terrible choice. I keep a copy just to round out party costs, but for anything substantive, you'd rather look at the higher rarity versions of this effect. Still, I'd say keep one just in case. Alright, hope you guys found this video useful, and if you're looking for more Fino in your life, I have a new channel dedicated to non-FGO content like, say, Gundam Evolution. Links below. Give me a follow to get on the ground floor, and I'll see you next time. Peace.